Imagine vanishing without a trace, only to be found later in the most inexplicable conditions. These are the cases that defy logic and leave us with more questions than answers. Today we'll explore 5 true missing 411 cases where survivors were discovered under mysterious, often chilling circumstances. From strange disappearances to baffling recoveries, these stories will make you question what really happens when someone goes missing. All of these tales will be narrated in first person to give a more realistic feel, but please understand that this is done purely for storytelling purposes and is in no way meant to disrespect anyone or diminish the gravity of these real-life events. Stay with us as we uncover the eerie truth behind these unsettling cases. It was the summer of 2001, and Yosemite National Park felt like the edge of the world, untouched and wild. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine, promising adventure with every step. I was 21, eager to explore, fueled by the kind of boundless energy that comes with youth. My friends and I had been planning this trip for months, hyped to immerse ourselves in Yosemite's vast beauty. It was a place where granite peaks rose like cathedrals and waterfalls sang through canyons, a world far removed from city life. We set off early, the sun rising behind us, casting long shadows on the trail. There were 5 of us, me, my best friend Mike, and 3 others from college. The plan was simple: hike part of the John Muir Trail and explore as much as possible over a week. For all of us, this was an escape, a chance to reconnect with nature and leave behind the noise of everyday life. Our spirits were high as we trekked. The rhythmic crunch of boots on dirt was punctuated by laughter and the occasional bird call. Hours passed, and as the sun climbed higher, I found myself craving a little solitude. While I loved the group dynamic, there was something about the wilderness that made me yearn to experience it alone, even if just for a short while. "Hey," I called out, slowing my pace until I was alongside Mike. "I'm going to take a detour near the Merced River. I'll catch up with you guys later." Mike looked skeptical. "Are you sure? This isn't exactly your backyard." I shrugged. "It's not like I'm going far, just a little adventure." Reluctantly, he nodded, and the group pressed on without me. I veered off onto a narrow path that snaked through dense trees. The sound of rushing water grew louder as I neared the river. When I reached it, I felt an instant sense of peace. The water glimmered in the sunlight, flowing over smooth stones, and the air was cool and damp. I sat on a large boulder at the edge, letting the serenity wash over me. I must have lost track of time. When I checked my watch, the shadows were long, and the chill of evening had set in. Realizing it was late, I stood up and started retracing my steps. But something felt off. The trail I'd followed earlier was nowhere to be found. The trees seemed denser, their trunks unfamiliar. My landmarks were gone, and as much as I tried to stay calm, the unease began to creep in. I walked faster, then slower, scanning my surroundings for anything familiar. It was useless. The landscape had transformed into an alien world, every direction blending into the next. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, panic had set in. I called out for my friends, but the dense forest swallowed my voice. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted. I had no food, no water, and no clue how far I had wandered. My flashlight cast weak beams that only deepened the shadows around me. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, and exhaustion weighed down my legs. Finally, I collapsed against a tree, wrapping my arms around myself for warmth. The night stretched on endlessly, every rustle and crack in the underbrush making me jump. The next morning, the sun's warmth woke me, but it was little comfort. My body ached, my throat was dry, and my mind was foggy. Still, I forced myself to keep moving. Hours blurred into days. I stumbled through the wilderness, desperate for water, for food, for rescue. My sense of time vanished, replaced by a primal instinct to survive. Then after what felt like a lifetime, I saw them. Searchers, a group of them, their voices muffled but urgent as they spotted me. I stumbled forward, barely able to stand, my throat too dry to call out. They rushed to me, offering water and food. Someone wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, their words a haze as they told me I'd been missing for 10 days. 10 days, I croaked. disbelief lacing my voice. It wasn't possible. I had only wandered off for an afternoon. How had I lost 10 whole days? They escorted me back to base camp, where my friends were waiting. Mike practically tackled me, his face pale with relief. "You're alive," he whispered. "We thought you were gone." Even as I embraced him, tears threatening to spill, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had no memory of those 10 days, no idea where I'd been or how I had survived. My mind felt like a blank slate, fragments of the forest blurring into an impossible dream. The searchers had their theories. Most believed I had simply wandered too far and succumbed to disorientation. But others whispered about strange things in Yosemite, stories of people who disappeared only to return with no memory, no explanation. I didn't know what to believe. Even now, years later, the details remain elusive, like a half-remembered nightmare. I walked out of the woods that day, but part of me, part of whatever happened out there, stayed behind, lost in the trees. The morning of September 14th, 2004, dawned foggy and cool, a typical autumn day in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Our group, 7 friends from school, had planned the hike for weeks. We were starting from Klingman's Dome, the highest point in the park, and intended to follow the Forney Ridge Trail to Andrews Bald. At 17, I loved the outdoors, the serenity, the way the forest seemed alive with mystery and beauty. That day, though, the woods felt different, almost too quiet, like the trees were holding their breath. We set out early, the chill in the air mixing with the earthy scent of wet leaves. The trail was slippery from recent rains, but we were excited, laughing and joking as we climbed. Mist clung to the trees, swirling in ghostly patterns. It was easy to fall behind or get ahead on the narrow path, especially when the fog thickened. Around midday, I noticed how far I drifted from the group. The laughter of my friends faded until it was just me, the wind, and the crunch of leaves underfoot. I called out, "Hey, wait up!" My voice echoed, but there was no response. I wasn't worried yet. They couldn't be far. I'd just gotten caught up in the view, distracted by the golden leaves and the play of light in the mist. I picked up my pace, thinking I'd catch them around the next bend. But when I rounded the corner, the trail wasn't there. Instead, I found myself in a dense thicket of trees. I turned back, retracing my steps, or so I thought, but nothing looked familiar. I wasn't just behind anymore. I was lost. At first, I told myself to stay calm. It was the Smokies, not some uncharted wilderness. I'd find my way back to the trail, but as the hours dragged on, panic began to set in. The sun was sinking lower, and the forest grew darker and colder. The mist thickened, wrapping around me like a shroud. Every direction looked the same. Tall trees, moss-covered rocks, and endless shadows. I shouted for help until my throat was raw, but the only answer was the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. I tried to remember the survival tips I'd read. Stay put, conserve energy, find water. But fear clouded my mind, and I kept moving, hoping I'd stumble onto a trail or hear the voices of my friends. Night fell quickly, and the forest transformed into something out of a nightmare. The once beautiful mist now felt oppressive, and every sound seemed magnified in the darkness. I huddled under a tree, shivering in my thin jacket. Hunger gnawed at me, and thirst burned my throat. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the creeping terror, but sleep was impossible. By the second day, my legs ached from scrambling over rocks and through brush. I'd found a small stream and drank greedily, but I had no food and my stomach cramped from hunger. The forest felt endless, like I was walking in circles. At one point, I thought I heard voices, faint and distant, but when I shouted back, the sound vanished like a cruel trick. I lost track of time. The hours blended together in a haze of fear and exhaustion. I imagined my friends and family worrying, search teams combing the trails, helicopters overhead. Why couldn't they find me? Why couldn't I find them? On the third day, I reached a clearing. The sun broke through the mist, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. I collapsed on a rock, too tired to go any farther. That's when I heard it, a rustling in the bushes followed by voices, real voices. My heart leapt as two searchers emerged, their eyes widening when they saw me. "Jared," one of them called out, "we've been looking for you." I could barely speak, my throat dry and my voice hoarse, but I managed to croak, "I'm here." They gave me water and wrapped me in a blanket, their faces a mixture of relief and amazement. I asked them how far I'd wandered. They told me I was miles from the trail, in a remote part of the park rarely visited by hikers. "How did you get here?" one of them asked, but I had no answer. I didn't know. The last few days were a blur of confusion and fear. I couldn't explain how I'd ended up so far from where I'd started or why I hadn't been able to find my way back. When they led me out of the woods, my friends were waiting, their faces pale and drawn. Mike, my closest friend, hugged me tightly. "We thought we'd lost you," he whispered. Even now, years later, I can't fully explain what happened. Some say the fog plays tricks on the mind, disorienting even the most experienced hikers. Others whisper about strange occurrences in the Smokies, people vanishing, only to reappear with no memory of their time in the woods. I try not to dwell on it too much, but sometimes late at night, I think about those 3 days. The forest took something from me, something I can't quite name, and while I walked out of those woods, part of me feels like I never truly left. October 15th, 2006. I was just 12 years old, full of curiosity and the kind of fearlessness that often comes with being young. My family and I were on a hike near Timberline Trail on Mount Hood, Oregon. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of pine, and the leaves crunched underfoot as we moved along the winding path. My mom, dad, and older brother Ethan led the way, their voices blending with the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I remember feeling like I was in another world, surrounded by towering evergreens and steep cliffs. We'd been hiking for a few hours when I noticed a smaller path veering off from the main trail. It looked like it led to something interesting, a grove or a viewpoint maybe. "Can I check that out?" I asked. My mom hesitated but eventually nodded. "Just don't go far, Mia," she warned. "We'll wait here." I promised I'd be back soon and darted off before anyone could change their minds. The trail was narrow, lined with moss-covered rocks and patches of wildflowers. I kept walking, marveling at how quiet it was compared to the main path. It felt like my own little adventure, and I was determined to see where it led. But as the minutes passed, I realized I had gone farther than I intended. The trail was fading, blending into the dense underbrush. When I turned to go back, everything looked different. The trees seemed taller, their branches intertwining to block the sunlight. I started walking faster, certain I'd find my way back soon, but no matter how far I went, the main trail never appeared. Panic crept in slowly at first, then all at once. I called out for my family, my voice echoing through the forest, but there was no answer. I screamed again, louder this time, but the only response was the distant call of a bird. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized I was lost. The sun was sinking lower, and the temperature was dropping fast. I tried to remember what I'd learned about survival. "Stay put," I whispered to myself. "Find shelter." I spotted a large rock overhang nearby and crawled underneath, pulling my jacket tight around me. The wind howled and the cold seeped into my bones. I was terrified, but I told myself I had to be brave. Someone would find me. The first night was the worst. I couldn't sleep, too scared of the dark and the strange sounds around me. Every snap of a twig made my heart race. I hugged my knees to my chest, shivering uncontrollably as frost coated the ground. When dawn finally broke, I felt a small spark of hope. Maybe today they'd find me. But the hours dragged on, and no one came. I was hungry, thirsty, and cold. I found a small stream nearby and drank from it, the icy water stinging my throat but easing the dryness. I thought about my family, about how worried they must be. I imagined them searching, calling my name, and it gave me strength to keep going. On the second day, the rain started. A relentless drizzle soaked through my clothes, chilling me to the core. I found another spot to shelter, a hollowed-out tree trunk, and crawled inside. The dampness was unbearable, but at least I was out of the rain. I whispered prayers, begging for someone to find me. I thought about stories I'd heard of people surviving in the wilderness, clinging to the idea that I could be one of them. By the third day, my body felt weak and my thoughts were muddled. The hunger was constant, a dull ache that wouldn't go away. My legs were scratched and bruised from stumbling through the brush, and my lips were cracked from the cold. I wanted to move, to do something, but I was too exhausted. All I could do was wait. And then, late in the afternoon, I heard it. Voices. Faint at first, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. I pushed myself up, summoning every ounce of strength I had left, and screamed, "I'm here! Help!" The voices grew louder, closer. Finally, two searchers appeared, their bright jackets a beacon against the green and gray of the forest. They ran toward me, their faces a mix of relief and urgency. "We've got her!" one of them shouted into a radio. They wrapped me in a thick blanket and gave me water, their voices soothing as they reassured me I was safe now. I was too weak to walk, so they carried me back to their base camp, where my family was waiting. My mom burst into tears when she saw me, pulling me into a tight hug. Ethan was crying too, though he tried to hide it. "You're so strong, Mia," my dad said, his voice breaking. "We're so proud of you." The doctor said I was lucky. Hypothermia and dehydration had taken a toll on my body, but I would recover. They said it was a miracle I'd survived, given the freezing temperatures and the rugged terrain. Even now, years later, I can still feel the cold and the fear when I think about those days. But I also remember the determination that kept me going. I survived because I stayed put, found shelter, and held on to hope. August 22nd, 2009. The day started like any other summer hike. Clear skies, warm air, and the promise of adventure. I'd driven out to Shenandoah National Park early that morning, parking at the Hawksbill Gap trailhead, ready to tackle the loop. I'd hiked this park before, but this trail was new to me, and that's what made it exciting. I'd mapped out a one-day route, planning to return to my car by late afternoon. I was 22 then, full of confidence in my skills and stamina. Hiking alone never bothered me. I enjoyed the solitude, the way the forest felt alive with the hum of insects, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional distant bird call. It was just me and the trail, a chance to clear my head and escape the noise of daily life. The first few hours passed without incident. The Hawksbill summit offered a breathtaking view of the valley below, the blue haze of the mountains stretching endlessly into the horizon. I stopped for a while, snapped a few photos, and had a quick snack before heading down the trail. That's when things started to go wrong. I missed a turn. I don't know how it happened. I'd been paying attention to the markers, or at least I thought I had. But as I walked, the trail became less defined, the markers sparse. I told myself I'd find the right path again if I just kept going. I didn't want to turn back, convinced I was close to rejoining the loop. It was only after another hour of hiking that I realized I was completely off course. Panic set in quickly. I was in the middle of Shenandoah National Park, surrounded by miles of dense forest, and I had no idea where I was. I pulled out my map, but without a clear point of reference, it was useless. My phone had no signal, and my water supply was dwindling. I tried retracing my steps, but the paths all looked the same, and soon I couldn't tell if I was heading back or getting deeper into the wilderness. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. I knew I couldn't keep moving in the dark, so I found a flat patch of ground and decided to stop for the night. I had no tent, no sleeping bag, just a light jacket and the clothes on my back. The forest came alive with night sounds, every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig making my heart race. I barely slept, my mind racing with thoughts of search parties and worst-case scenarios. By morning, dehydration and hunger were already taking their toll. I drank the last of my water and tried to focus on finding a stream. I remembered from an old survival guide that following water might lead to civilization. After hours of stumbling through the brush, I heard the faint trickle of a creek. Relief washed over me as I knelt by the water, cupping my hands and drinking deeply. For the next 2 days, I followed the creek, hoping it would lead me somewhere recognizable. The forest was relentless, steep inclines, tangled underbrush, and the unyielding August heat. I rationed what little food I had left, But by the third day, I was weak, my legs shaky and my head pounding. Every step felt like a monumental effort, but stopping wasn't an option. I told myself that if I just kept moving, someone would find me. On the fourth day, I heard voices, faint at first, almost like a dream. I called out, my voice hoarse and barely audible, but the sound grew louder. A group of searchers emerged from the trees, their bright jackets a welcome contrast against the greens and browns of the forest. Relief flooded me as one of them rushed forward, helping me to sit down. "We've been looking for you, Kyle," he said, handing me a bottle of water. "You're lucky to be alive." They radioed in my location and helped me to their base camp, where paramedics checked me over. I was dehydrated, disoriented, and covered in scratches, but otherwise unharmed. The doctors said it was a miracle I'd survived, given the heat and the challenges of navigating the rugged terrain. My family was waiting for me at the hospital, their faces a mixture of relief and anger. My mom hugged me so tightly I thought I might pass out. "What were you thinking? Hiking alone?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. I didn't have a good answer. I thought I'd been prepared, but the truth was I'd underestimated the power of nature. The wilderness doesn't care about your confidence or your plans. It humbles you, tests you, and if you're lucky, it lets you go. Even now, I can't fully explain how I managed to survive those 4 days. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was sheer luck. All I know is that when I hike now, I never go alone, and I never take the trail for granted. Shenandoah taught me a lesson I'll carry with me forever. Respect the wild, or it will remind you who's really in charge. July 7th, 2004. My name is Josh, and I was 12 years old when my 10-year-old brother Ben and I got lost in the Lost Creek wilderness of Colorado. It was supposed to be a fun summer hike with our Uncle Mike, who loved taking us into the mountains near his cabin. The morning was perfect. Clear skies, crisp mountain air, and the promise of adventure. Uncle Mike led us along a winding trail, pausing every so often to point out animal tracks, wildflowers, or the occasional bird call. Ben and I followed eagerly, feeling like real explorers. Around midday, we stopped for lunch near a bubbling creek. Uncle Mike joked about how the water was so clean you could drink it, though we stuck to our bottles. Ben and I splashed around in the stream, cooling off after the morning's hike. Nearby, we spotted a narrow side path that disappeared into the trees. It looked mysterious, like it led to some secret place, and we couldn't resist. "Can we check it out?" I asked, practically bouncing with excitement. Uncle Mike hesitated, glancing at the dense trees. "Just don't go far, and stay where I can see you," he finally said. We promised, and with that, we were off. The trail twisted and turned, and before we knew it, we couldn't see Uncle Mike anymore. "We should head back," Ben said nervously, but I waved him off. "It's just around this bend," I assured him. But when we turned back, the trail didn't look the same. Every turn seemed unfamiliar, and soon panic set in. "We're lost," Ben whispered, his voice trembling. I swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. "We'll figure it out," I said, taking his hand. "We just need to retrace our steps." But every attempt to find the main trail led us deeper into the forest. The towering trees, which had seemed beautiful earlier, now felt oppressive and disorienting. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched long across the ground, making the forest even more eerie. By nightfall, we were exhausted, hungry, and scared. We found a large tree and huddled beneath it, using our backpacks as pillows. The forest came alive with strange sounds, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and distant animal calls. Every noise felt like it was just a few feet away. Ben clung to me, quietly crying. "They'll find us," I whispered, though fear clawed at my stomach. The next morning, hunger and thirst took hold. We followed the sound of water and found a stream. It was icy cold and refreshing, though it did little to fill the gnawing emptiness in our stomachs. We had half a granola bar and some trail mix left, which we split into tiny portions. I made a game of it, telling Ben we were rationing like real adventurers. For days, we wandered through the wilderness, sticking close to the stream. The July heat was relentless, sapping our energy with every step. The terrain was unforgiving. Dense thickets tore at our clothes, and steep inclines left us gasping for breath. At night, the temperature dropped sharply, and we shivered under the thin shelter of trees. By the fifth day, our strength was almost gone. Ben's lips were cracked, and my legs felt like lead every time we moved. But even then, he never let go of my hand. "We're going to make it," he said one night, echoing the words I'd told him so many times. His faith in me, in us, was the only thing that kept me going. On the 8th day, when hope was beginning to fade, we heard something, a faint sound, almost like voices. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but Ben grabbed my arm, his eyes wide with excitement. "Someone's here," he whispered. We scrambled toward the sound, yelling as loud as we could. Through the trees, a man in an orange vest appeared, his face a mixture of relief and disbelief. "I've got them," he shouted into his radio. Within moments, more rescuers arrived, wrapping us in blankets and giving us water. I clung to Ben, overwhelmed by the sudden flood of safety. When we reached the search base, Uncle Mike was there, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, boys," he said, pulling us into a hug. I didn't say much, too exhausted to speak, but I could feel the relief in his embrace. The doctors were amazed we had survived 8 days in the wilderness. They said drinking from the stream and staying calm had likely saved us. But for me, the real reason was Ben. We kept each other going, even when things seemed impossible. Looking back, I'm still not sure how we made it through. People called it a miracle, but I think it was something more, a testament to the strength of family and the will to survive. I haven't gone hiking much since then, but if I ever do, I'll carry the lessons of Lost Creek with me. Respect the wilderness, trust your instincts, and never leave your loved ones behind. It was February 7th, 2018, when I set off for what was supposed to be an ordinary skiing trip at Whiteface Mountain in New York. I was with some friends looking forward to a fun day in the snow. The weather was perfect, cold, clear skies, and ideal conditions for skiing. After spending some time on the main slopes, I decided to take a solo run down a trail I knew well. The mountain was quieter than usual, and everything felt strangely peaceful, almost too quiet. I started skiing down, the familiar trail below me. But after a while, something felt off. The landscape around me began to blur together, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I was getting farther from where I knew. It wasn't long before I realized I had wandered off track, and the surroundings weren't as familiar as they should have been. At first, I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing looked right. The cold began to sink deeper into my bones, and panic started to set in. I wasn't sure how I had gotten so lost on a trail I had skied countless times. The mountain was vast, and now everything seemed alien. I attempted to call for help, but my phone had no signal. Hours passed, and nightfall was quickly approaching. I thought of turning back, but it was getting harder to see and figure out where I was. The snow began to fall heavier, and I huddled under a tree trying to stay warm. My only thoughts were to survive the night and find my way back. I didn't know how long I was there, but it felt like an eternity. Every movement felt slow, like I was trapped in a world where time didn't make sense. The isolation was suffocating. By morning, I was freezing, exhausted, and disoriented. The hours seemed to drag on with no sign of help. The search for me began when my friends realized I hadn't returned to the lodge. They thought maybe I was somewhere around the mountain, but as the hours stretched into the day, they began to worry. A full-scale search was launched, but despite all the effort, no sign of me appeared. Days passed with no progress, and the weather turned harsh. The search continued, but the authorities had little hope. On February 13th, after 6 days of searching, they called off the search, assuming I had perished in the cold. My family was devastated. It seemed like I was lost for good. My friends and loved ones mourned me, and life, as it often does, began to move on without answers. Then something incredible happened. On February 26th, nearly 2 weeks after I had gone missing, I woke up. I was lying in a hospital bed, not in New York, but in Sacramento, California, 3,000 miles away. The sudden realization that I wasn't where I had been felt surreal. I had no memory of how I had gotten there, no recollection of anything between the moment I had been lost and when I opened my eyes in that sterile hospital room. I was surrounded by doctors who were as confused as I was. They asked me if I had been kidnapped, but I couldn't remember anything. I had no idea how I had traveled so far or how I had ended up in California. It was like the past few days, what had actually happened, were just a blank spot in my memory. I couldn't answer any of their questions, and neither could anyone else. My family was just as stunned as I was. How had I traveled across the country, seemingly without explanation? There were no signs of kidnapping or foul play, and yet here I was. Some people suggested that I had been in some kind of mental breakdown, wandering aimlessly, but that didn't explain the distance I had covered, or the fact that I had no recollection of the time lost. Others speculated that something more sinister had happened, but I had no answers. Since that day, the theories have only grown. Some people believed I had been abducted and transported. Others thought it could have been a medical condition, though nothing was ever confirmed. To this day, I have no idea what happened during those missing days. The mystery of my disappearance continues to haunt me, and I can't shake the strange sense of confusion that has lingered since. I still don't know how I ended up in Sacramento or what really happened in those lost days. The search efforts, the people looking for me, all of it felt like something out of a dream, something beyond ordinary explanation. While I am grateful to be alive, the gap in my memory remains, a piece of my life that I'll never get back. Whatever happened to me during those days is something I'll probably never fully understand. It was October 8th, 2019, when I decided to go on a solo day hike in Yosemite National Park. Hiking had always been my way to escape, and the mist trail was familiar terrain. The weather that morning was perfect, cool, sunny, and alive with the sense of pine and damp earth. I arrived at the trailhead around 8 a.m., parked my car, and sent my mom a quick text. "Starting now, we'll be back early afternoon. Love you?" Her reply came immediately. "Stay safe. Love you too." My backpack was filled with essentials: water, protein bars, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, my phone, and a lightweight jacket tied around my waist. The trail was busy that morning, full of families, groups of friends, and fellow solo hikers. I made good time, stopping to take a few photos at Vernal Falls before continuing on toward Nevada Falls. By noon, I reached the top, and I found a quiet spot away from the crowds. I kicked off my boots, ate a granola bar, and drank in the sweeping view of the valley below. The sound of rushing water filled the air, and it felt like I was in my own peaceful world. It was perfect. That's the last clear memory I have. When I woke up, it was pitch black. The once roaring falls were gone, replaced by eerie silence. My head throbbed and I was disoriented. I sat up slowly, trying to make sense of where I was. I was lying on rough ground, surrounded by dense trees, far from any trail I recognized. My backpack was still with me, but my phone was missing. I checked my watch. It read 2:14 a.m. Panic set in. I had no idea how I'd gotten there, or how much time had passed. My last memory was sitting at Nevada Falls, resting and enjoying the view. I shouted for help, but there was no response. Not a sound of any wildlife. The silence was unnerving. I decided to stay put until daylight. I feared if I tried to move, I'd get even more lost. The temperature was dropping fast, and the cold seeped into my bones. I layered my jacket over myself and curled up at the base of a tree, trying to stay warm. Sleep didn't come. My mind raced with questions. Had I fallen? Had someone taken me? Why couldn't I remember anything after sitting down at Nevada Falls? When dawn finally broke, I tried to make sense of my surroundings. The landscape was rugged, unfamiliar, and much more remote than I had imagined. There was no sign of a trail, and my water supply had run out. I felt dehydrated, and the hunger pangs were starting to set in. But I knew I couldn't stay there. I decided to move. Heading downhill seemed logical, so I started walking, stumbling over rocks and tangled roots. After hours of exhausting effort, I found a small stream. Drinking from it felt like a lifeline, giving me just enough strength to keep going. By mid-afternoon, I came across a dry creek bed and followed it, hoping it would lead to civilization. After a few more hours of trekking, I saw movement up ahead, 2 figures in bright jackets. It was a search and rescue team. Relief flooded through me and I waved frantically, shouting for help. They ran toward me asking if I was okay. I couldn't hold back the tears. I broke down in their arms, overwhelmed by the emotions I couldn't put into words. They told me I had been missing for 3 days. Back at their base camp, I was given water, food, and a blanket. They asked me to recount what had happened, but I had no answers. I told them I remembered sitting at Nevada Falls and then waking up in the wilderness. They exchanged concerned glances but didn't press me further. They checked my vitals, determined I was dehydrated and bruised but otherwise fine, and arranged for me to be taken to the hospital for further evaluation. Later I learned that I had been found 7 miles from Nevada Falls, in an area so remote that even experienced hikers rarely ventured there. Search teams had combed the main trails and surrounding areas for days, with no sign of me until I stumbled into that canyon. My family was waiting for me at the ranger station when I was finally brought back. The look of relief on my mom's face when she hugged me is something I'll never forget. Even now, I can't explain what happened. I have no memory of walking those 7 miles, no injuries to suggest a fall, and no idea how my phone vanished. Some speculated that I might have become disoriented due to dehydration or hypothermia, but I wasn't gone long enough for those theories to fully explain the blackout. I can only guess what happened in those missing hours. Since then, I've read about other hikers who went missing under strange circumstances and reappeared far from where they were last seen. It's unsettling to think about. While I still love hiking, I've never gone back to Yosemite alone. Whatever happened during those missing hours, it's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. As we wrap up today's story, the mystery of missing 411 cases leaves us questioning the unknown. People disappearing in strange circumstances, only to be found under bizarre and often unexplained conditions. These stories remind us that not everything in the wilderness is as it seems. In the silence of the woods, beware what you can't hear. If you're drawn to eerie tales like these, don't forget to subscribe to Huskborn Horrors. The darkness is waiting, and we'll be here, ready to tell you its secrets.